After this presentation, we will open it up to questions and comments. So for now, I would like to pass it over to Erin Kirkpatrick.
Thanks, Arun. My name is Erin Kirkpatrick. I'm one of our community services managers on the recreation side and one of the project managers for this study. My co-manager, Mercedes Payne, is also on the meeting tonight, but I wanted to just take a moment and welcome you all here. Thank you for taking some time out of your your dinner hour to join us. Our Parks and Recreation Department is conducting this study to help us prioritize our projects and to better serve our community. We have our recently adopted Parks and Recreation Master Plan as of 2021 that gives us guidance for the city as a whole. And this study was one of the first action items coming out of that plan. It kicked off in the summer of 2022 and seeks to prioritize equity and give focus to an inclusive engagement process. The Equity in Action Initiative also gives us some footing for undertaking this study. Next slide, please. Tempe, as we know, is a city that has experienced a lot of growth lately. Changing demographics require new strategies and approaches for both programming and the use of park spaces. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry, my notes are a little bit off. This is the project statement for the study. We are conducting a holistic analysis of Parks and Recreation to generate actionable items that create a more equitable and inclusive play spaces. Next slide. This is the schedule of our project thus far. Basically, we have a lot of background and demographic information that we're kind of grounding ourselves in as we move into research, assessment, and findings. And at each step of the way, we're really taking it back to the community, asking questions, digging in with some focus groups and our community partners, as well as our city project team and city stakeholders as well. So right now we're in that kind of April to May zone, starting to pull together all of the data and research and really bringing it out to the community to make sure that what we're hearing is what holistically the community wants us to be focused on. Next slide, please. Through this process, we have use multiple engagement efforts and strategies. We have a program that we call our Community Navigator program, and this has been really instrumental in employing people who are either representative of or have experience working with particular demographic backgrounds that we really want to make sure are the focus of the efforts of this study. So they have gone out into the community and performed some park assessments, as well as some intercept interviews with folks who are in our parks and recreation spaces and places. We've also hosted focus groups with parks and recreation users and stakeholders, and had some pop-up engagement at some of our Arts in the Parks events and other city-wide events like the Unity Walk. And we have evaluated at this point 42 of our parks and all of our recreation centers with an eye to DEI assessments. And basically what this means is, although we've already previously with our kind of CIP and general maintenance and operations, we've identified the life cycle, the condition of our parks and facilities. But these assessments are really digging into how are our spaces used? How does it feel to be in them? Who's in them? And how do they feel in terms of being able to access the space? And are there things in the parks and recreation spaces that make them feel welcome make them feel like they belong? And are there things that they want to use and participate in? And so that's kind of been the focus of our engagement to date. We've also hosted a community forum, sorry about that, with City of Tempe staff, also to get interest in the study, investment in the study, and to help to our staff to understand how the recommendations coming out of the study will help to align with and support other initiatives across the city. Next slide, please. And then kind of coming out of this initial analysis, what have we learned so far? Addressing equity is key for public health. Nearly 21% of Tempe's population reports low levels of physical activity, and more than 16% report frequent mental health distress. We know that time spent outdoors in nature, recreating, can help to reduce the impacts of both of these issues and contribute to better health outcomes overall. We also find that coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, just how key our parks and recreation spaces were to keeping people connected to wellness, but also connected to one another. Next slide, please. Another thing that has come out of our initial analysis are some mapping exercises. This particular one is our equity zone, and it's really forms the foundation of the effort so far in the equity study. So these are areas of the city that have above average concentrations and risks in both socioeconomic vulnerability and for public health concerns. So some of the data that we've pulled to create these maps is a little bit different than what we've used in other city initiatives. And the shaded areas on the map signify those equity zones. Very high is darker, high, a little bit lighter than that, medium, and then the areas that are not shaded have not been identified as an equity priority. And basically, what that means is that the folks that live in these particular areas of town have either more potential exposure to things that would cause them to be socioeconomically disadvantaged or socioeconomically vulnerable, but also have potentially some more exposure to those kind of environmental concerns and risks that would put them in that vulnerable category. You can kind of see how that starts to aggregate across the city. Next slide, please. Another thing that we've been diving into is how accessible are our parks and recreation facilities, and identifying some of those areas that may be experiencing gaps. We know that folks who have easy access to parks and recreation tend to use them more than those who can't walk within a 10-minute walk. So to better understand park accessibility, we've investigated what we're calling the walk shed. So within half a mile or 10 minutes of walking distance between a residential address, is there a park or recreation facility? Households that are within that half mile are considered to have close proximity. And the analysis also uses the existing transportation system. So the pedestrian networks that might exist in a neighborhood, the bridge that might get you over the canal, the bridge that might get you over the highway, but it excludes things like railroads and canals and highways where you would not be able to easily get over them with your feet or your bike or your wheels. So areas shown in tan here are residential addresses that are within a park and recreation gap, meaning they cannot access an open and available park and recreation center within a 10-minute walk of their home. So 70% of homes within Tempe can access that park and recreation center, and 30% of homes cannot. More acutely, we understand that 19% of the homes that do not have access are condos, apartments, or trailers. Next slide, please. And then we come to our DEI park assessments, which I talked about a little bit earlier. So using our community navigators, who represent a diverse group of local community members who were hired for the purpose of supporting the engagement around this study, we've conducted over 330 assessments of 42 parks and recreation spaces. And here you can see a couple of pictures from some of those engagements, which mostly happened in February. Next slide, please. We've used a workbook that identifies 4 criteria for assessing these park spaces based on best practices for creating inclusive public spaces. So the categories are social mixing, program diversity, feelings of safety, and access and amenities. And then on the right, you can see an example of one of the worksheets in the assessment book. Next slide, please. So initial ranking of parks and recreation spaces has emerged from these park assessments. Common themes among the 10 facilities with the highest scores were positive feelings of safety, diverse programming opportunities, and noticeable social mixing. In the feelings of safety category, assessors noticed factors that made them feel safe, including the presence of other people, especially families, and security patrolling the premises. The facility location also influenced feelings of safety. One assessor noted the neighborhood is very low-key and relaxing. Facilities that offer diverse programs and had diverse amenities, including volleyball courts, dog runs, sports fields, tennis courts, lightings, and bathrooms all scored very high. Diverse programming also correlated with social mixing because the different activities attracted different types of people. Clearly and highly visible signage also correlated with high scores in the access and amenities category. On the other end, common themes among the 10 facilities with the lowest scores were a lack of amenities or programming and difficulty accessing the space. The specific amenities that assessments noted would add to the park's rating were sufficient lighting, shade structures, restrooms, and drinking fountains. The presence of litter or other identifiably maintenance concerns or lack of care also seemed to indicate that the space was less safe. Feelings of safety are also affected by the presence of people experiencing homelessness and proximity to high speed or high volume traffic. In response to the social mixing and activation categories, assessors noticed that it was different to rate based on the low number of people in the park. In instances where the parks were populated, there was little to no interaction between the disparate individuals or the groups. So the folks that were there were not necessarily interacting with one another. The facility with the lowest score overall from these assessments was Birchett Park. And it received low scores due to its isolated location, which was perceived to be unsafe and inaccessible. Assessments also indicated there wasn't any reason for someone to visit the park. Tempe Women's Club Park was closed for construction during the survey period, it should be noted. There was an irrigation project there that actually ended up closing down most of the park, and that wasn't expected. Next slide, please. So to reiterate, these assessments and inquiries are built upon the 2021 Tempe Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Results from the public engagement there provided some indication about the inequalities, issues, and needs that could be identified. Primarily that safety and maintenance were concerns. With safety identified as the biggest barrier to park use, we wanted to better understand what it means to people, as perceptions of safety can vary greatly person to person. Survey responses from some neighborhoods rated the quality of parks much higher than others, such as a poor rating in the Rio Salado neighborhoods. And they let us know that targeted assessments were needed to try to figure out what was happening neighborhood to neighborhood. But also there was recognition of gaps in who participated in the survey. Even though that was one of our most successful surveying efforts, we still had some noticeable areas of the city that were lacking in responses. And we needed some other strategies to make sure we were hearing from everyone. Next slide, please. There are some equity issues that we're trying to dig into with this study that are very specific to Tempe. The headline about renaming parks is a more obvious example of addressing inequity. But environmental factors here in the Sonoran Desert, such as drought, climate change, and a rise in temperatures, as well as equitable shade and trees, are others. The environmental factors in Tempe have disproportional impacts on specific populations, as we also learned from the river bottom. Next slide, please. The project team has been doing research to dig into these topics and more, seeking to understand gaps in the system, how to make improvements in parks and recreation spaces to make them feel and function more inclusively, and what the community needs in your public spaces. Our aim is to hear from community members and truly listen to your stories. How do you use your park spaces? What do you want to see in the future? Have you or others that you care about been left out in the past? How do you want decisions to be prioritized as we move forward? Next slide, please. So on that note, we want to make sure that we hear from you. Here's how to participate. Next slide. Starting today and for the next 3 weeks, we're asking the community to tell us more about park spaces by conducting an overall public survey. The survey will help us understand the community's priorities and how to invest in parks and recreation spaces in the future. You can find the survey at tempe.gov/makingspace or use the QR code on the screen right now to get to the project page. You're also invited to the Making Space Festival. It's a neighborhood party in Escalante Park on May 10th from 5:30 to 7:30. We have booths and activities from community members and community partners that help to highlight some of the ways this equity study could bring more activity or different types of things to our parks in the future. There'll be booths on urban forestry, on outdoor recreation. We are partnering with a local foods initiative. There's bike repair and music. Bring your kids, bring your parents, bring your neighbors, bring your boss, maybe even bring your dogs. It'll be fun for everyone and we hope to see you there. Next slide. And then just a little bit more about the survey. Please take the survey, please invite your neighbors to, anybody else who's involved in Tempe at all. It's really geared towards your individual perspective. We want to know how you want the city to invest in park spaces in the future. We want to know how you experience our park spaces currently. And we also really want to know from people who may not use our parks or facilities. We want to know why. So please spread the word, far and wide as much as you can. And it will really help us in our planning for the future. And on that note, if anyone has any questions, I'll open it up. I'm just going to check the chat real quick. I think I can see that. Not seeing it. I think everyone should have the ability to unmute themselves at this point if you do have any questions or want to share any information. All right, if no one has anything, I will just say, oh. Thanks, Miriam. Great question. So Miriam's asking that why we only mentioned 42 parks. So we did kind of narrow down our focus. We have 56 to 62 parks in our city, depending on who you ask. We did pick 42. We tried to exclude ones that were currently under remodel, since you wouldn't be getting quite you know, an accurate picture of their usage since they were out of commission. We also tried to pick representative parks that might be able to stand in for others. And that was kind of based on our setup for our community navigator program too, to make sure that each of the parks could be assessed well, and that we had enough people to move around them. But we did identify our preserve spaces. As I said, all of our facilities on the recreation side were looked at. We had one sports complex, but not Benedict Fields, and then a mix of neighborhood, community, and urban parks, as well as all of our regional parks. We have some parks like Kiwanis that you could break into, you know, 7 zones. So we had to spread people out a little bit around those, and the same thing with Rio Salado. But yeah, that's basically why we didn't assess every single park. And then that's a great question too. So Miriam lives near Dwight Park, which is only 4 acres, relatively small. A lot of it serves as retention for the neighborhood. You know, what could be put there? How could it be improved? And that's kind of where this targeted community engagement piece comes from. So we want to know from the neighborhood, you know, what would you want to see there? And in general, who is in the community that this park might be able to be reflective of? You know, do you have a lot of joggers? Do you have a lot of walkers? You know, creating that synergy there might be a great fit. There are other programming pieces we can also do in park spaces that we don't necessarily do across the board yet too. So sometimes it's bringing in those pop-up activities or those you know, performances like Arts in the Parks, those types of things, programming the park, maybe not with something permanent all the time, but something that could increase activity. But yeah, that's exactly, those are the questions this study's, you know, really trying to get at. What do people find in terms of their values to be the most important types of things to invest in our parks? And, you know, what would the community support in moving forward? And the burrs, yeah, that's a never-ending issue at a lot of our parks. And I'll send that comment over, Miriam, to our park supervisors too on the burrs. It's yeah, this time of year is when we start to notice it the most. I will say too, just a note, and this is just an aside, but we're also taking input right now as a city on the realignment of the bikeway north to south along Roosevelt, and Dwight Park is one of the spaces that they've identified that bikeway to come through. So take a look at that as well. It's definitely going to provide a little bit more walking and access in the park, and it almost creates a loop around the park at this point too. Not our project on the Parks and Recreation side, but one that we're aware of. All right, anything from anybody else? All right, well, we appreciate your attendance tonight, and I hope you can spread the word. Stay tuned for more social media posts, more signs popping up in your park. As I said earlier, this particular study is in the outreach phase for the next 3 weeks. The survey will be open. So plenty of time to share your input. If you've got any other questions that you'd rather ask offline, feel free to give me a call, or Mercedes. I guess we didn't save our contact info on this presentation, but my direct line is 350-8112. That's 480-350-8112, or Erin_Kirkpatrick at tempe.gov. And I'm happy to hear any opinions or input you want to give. Thank you all. Have a great night.